This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
Bunyan is communicating to us that ignorance and somebody who has operated on little faith sometimes are hard to distinguish, and he's gonna give us a window into a genuine believer who operates with very little faith. But he wants us to understand that, by contrast, ignorance is good by his own admission, but little faith is actually good.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well and looking forward to continuing our pilgrimage.
We are marching our way through Pilgrim's Progress with our trusted guide, Dr. Jeff Stivason. Jeff, of course, as our listeners will know, is the pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania, and is a professor at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Jeff, before I welcome you in, I want to read part of Pilgrim's Progress that will lead us into the section we're going to look at today. We left off with the shepherds, and then Bunyan writes this: "And I slept and dreamed again, and saw the same two pilgrims going down the mountains along the highway towards the city. Now a little below these mountains on the left hand lieth the country of Conceit, from which country there comes into the way in which the pilgrims walked a little crooked lane. Here, therefore, they met with a very brisk lad that came out of that country, and his name was Ignorance." So, Jeff, let's begin with Ignorance, this man they meet as they head down the mountains.
Yeah, ignorance is gonna be with us from now until the rest of the story, until the very end. Actually, he's going to be the character that we're going to meet with at the very end, because ignorance goes to his perdition. So he begins here. We're going to see him pop up a few times, and then they're going to finally deal with him. But in the end of the story, he's going to go down to perdition. But we start with him here, but we don't spend a lot of time with him, just enough for the pilgrims to get familiar with him and to realize that this is either a new believer who can think a little too much of his own wisdom, or this is one from the country of Conceit, and he's ignorant and knows nothing about salvation. I think that's where we meet him, and then basically they put him on the back burner. They say, you know what, let's give him a little time. What do you do with ignorance? You don't give him too much all at once. You give him a little, and then you come back to him, and you see how that's worked its way into his thinking, if at all.
And we should note that Ignorance, at least in his own estimation, is someone who knows the Lord's will and lives well and prays and fasts and pays tithes and alms. And so part of Ignorance's ignorance is of his own status before the Lord and his own standing before God.
Yeah, he's a good liver. He lives a good life. And it's funny, he talks about himself as, finding his way into the way of salvation because he's been good, and he's been good like other people have been good, and so he sees himself as good.
And yet Christian sort of sniffs that out by saying to Hopeful that he's really worse than a fool, because he's just walking by his own wisdom.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting. Bunyan wants us to make the comparison between, he's gonna move us along. He's gonna put ignorance on the back burner, and they're gonna meet with another guy who's being carried off by demons, who's named Turnaway, and then that's gonna cause Christian to remember a guy by the name of Little Faith. And the reason I usher him up into the conversation now is because it's interesting that ignorance describes himself as good, a good liver. He gets into the way of salvation as other good people do. But Bunyan wants us to see that little faith, by comparison, is a good man. He says like about 4 different times that little faith is a good man. And I think the reason that he brings these two characters together at this point is Bunyan is communicating to us that ignorance and somebody who has operated on little faith sometimes are hard to distinguish. And he's gonna give us a window into a genuine believer who operates with very little faith. But he wants us to understand that, by contrast, ignorance is good by his own admission, but little faith is actually good.
So talk us through little faith a little bit. You've already kind of introduced him, and as you said, Bunyan sort of transitions to focusing on him more than ignorance, although ignorance will come back up as you mentioned. But paint us a picture of little faith. Even expand on what you've already said.
Yeah, little faith is interesting, and and again brought into comparison with ignorance. Notice they when ignorance comes in, they pass by a little way, and there's a dark lane there, and so on. And this is they're around when these demons are carrying this guy away. His name's Turnaway, and then when Christian tells the story about little faith, he says, little faith came upon this lane. And all of a sudden, you think to yourself, this dark lane where they encounter ignorance and turn away. Little faith encounters this lane, and this lane is a lane where the Broadway gate comes down, and it's called Dead Man's Lane. So you get the idea, like this is a dark, ominous lane, and little faith has the terrible misfortune or terrible decision making skills, lack of discernment, however we phrase it, of going to sleep at that lane, and and yet nonetheless he's a good man, and goes to sleep. And there are three, Bunyan calls them three sturdy rogues, who set upon him and rob him: faint heart, mistrust, and guilt. And they sort of leave him in a lurch, and in and we'll talk about the way in which they leave him. But there's one thing, I love Bunyan, and but there's one thing here in the telling of this tale that I struggle with, and that is he says little faith, when these three rogues upon him. He says that little faith basically turns white as a sheet, and then he says this: he had neither power to fight nor fly. And that strikes me as he's paralyzed. There's a paralysis, and so when I think about that, I think about Revelation 21:8, where it talks about those who are cowardly and faithless, they'll be cast into the lake of fire. And when you go to Mark chapter 5, Jesus says to the disciples, cast about on the wind and the waves with him in the boat, why are you so afraid? And he uses that word, dilois, cowardly. Why are you so cowardly? Why are you paralyzed, essentially? And when somebody is so afraid that they're paralyzed, something else is their sovereign. We can be fearful of things, but when we're cowardly afraid, that's when we're in danger of being cast into the lake of fire. Now, I get it. I mean, if Bunyan's onto that, it's a really, I mean, it kind of gives the impression that, is this man ignorance or is he little faith? So if that's what he's saying, I'm totally on board with him. But if he means that he was really dilois, really cowardly, really paralyzed, then I have to back away from that, because he actually has a little faith, and that's something.
Yeah, I think I mean, even to the point of Matthew 14, the wind and the waves. And actually, that's a theme through Matthew, isn't it? Because I think this is where he's getting it. Matthew, multiple times, Jesus confronts, "Oh, ye of little faith." And it actually comes up like 5 times. And then even in Matthew 28, on the mount, when he goes to meet them, it says they worshiped him, though some doubted. And I think
Yeah.
the doubters were among the worshipers. So, like, we shouldn't put the doubters as the unbelievers that are cast out. But I think that's actually Matthew 28's way of like recapitulating the little faith theme, that's the
Yeah.
faith theme that's going on through the gospel. And so it's a little bit tricky as to what to do with it, because there is a kind of paralysis of being gripped by fear. And I
Yeah.
think especially if Peter's sinking into the water, oh, the wind and the waves, and he takes his eyes off of Jesus, and the faith isn't strong, the faith is weak, and it's easily diverted by trouble, and it loses for a moment sight of its object. And then the rebuke, ye of little faith, or why do you doubt? Those sorts of questions. But they come to someone who's not a perennial or persistent doubter, but they're easily overcome. And
Yeah.
it makes me think, even Jeff, sometimes of Old Testament passages too, like
Hmm.
Psalm 46. God is our ever-present help, our refuge, our strength.
Yeah.
Therefore, we will not fear.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to this, that there's a courageous Christianity, but there's a little faith Christianity that
Yeah.
needs to overcome fears.
Yeah, I get the reason I go back to Matthew 5 is I think about that story in the boat, and obviously it's parallel to the ones you're mentioning, Matthew 14 and so on. But um, Jesus asks them, "Why are you dilois? Why are you cowardly? Why are you so afraid? Have you no faith?" And then they say, "Who is this?" And then it's funny because the next story is the demoniac who answers their question, "You are the Christ." And then the next story is the sandwich story of the man's daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. And without kind of working through all that, when you get to the man who's, his daughter's, basically dead, right? She dies. And Jesus says to him, "Do not fear, believe," or have faith. So, like, you get this um, why are you so afraid? Why don't you, where's your faith? B, who is this? B, you're the son of the most high God. And then A, or A prime, B prime, A prime. Um, this is, guys, this is what believing and not fearing looks like. It's really,
Hmm.
I think it's right. I think it's, here's a little faith theology. This is what it looks like, guys. And so it's kind of precious. It's Sinclair Ferguson says it, and he may get it from somebody else, but probably a Puritan. But he used to say, "A little faith lays hold of a whole Christ." And that's the kind of summation of these sort of biblical stories. I think that's the summation of the little faith and the progress here.
And I think, but the progress is, he is confronting it, even as Jesus
Yes.
confronts it. So I think we
Yeah.
can sometimes sort of fall back on our heels and say, if a little faith gets a whole Christ, then that's enough for me. And yet that doesn't seem like that's enough for Christ when he's dealing with his disciples,
Yeah.
or for Christian and hopeful as they're dealing with the little faith character, or at least telling the tale of the little faith character.
Yeah, because he trundles along, doesn't he? I mean, and he always appears as if, sort of the curtain's about to go down on him, which is why I think that Bunyan says, "Hey, we're going to talk about ignorance, and by the way, let's talk about turn away." And that reminds me of the story of little faith. Why? Because they all have they all have these threads in common. But um, that leads to like what you're talking about, what the kind of the what's going on here. I mean, they rob him, and when they rob him, uh, he talks about how almost all of his spending money is gone. But they leave him a little spending money, and you're like, what is that spending money? And then you read on a little further, and you realize that, for instance, it says like he began to be comforted, but every time he began to be comforted, and I think that's the little spending money he was left with, comfort and assurance. And every time that he starts to be comforted with the little spending money, he starts to think about his losses and then never actually taps into the jewels that, the robbers didn't want, which I think the jewels, the riches that he does possess that the world wants nothing to do with are the jewels, the riches that he possesses in union with Christ. And so what I think the picture is that he's got a little spending money, but he never draws down on his account to really draw down on the riches that are in Christ. So he trundles along. He lives in complaint. And when you live, and you know as well as I do, if you're a Christian who lives in your complaints, then you're never drawing down on your resources that are in Christ. And I think that's where he is. Yeah.
So Jeff, that kind of takes us where I was hoping we would get, which is what do we draw from him? On the one hand, there's encouragement with little faith because he trundles along, as you
Yeah.
said. But on the other hand, it's a cautionary tale because while he does possess little faith, is overwhelmed by fear, overwhelmed by complaint. He's always focused on what he doesn't have, what he's lost. Never seems to, as you say, draw down on what he does have. Is that the takeaway, do you think, from the example of little faith?
Well, I think that's the warning. I think the takeaway is what he tells us. He says to us that a person that a great heart person, and I think what he's doing here is he's taking us back to the fifth lesson in the House of Interpreter, the valiant man, and I think he's saying not everybody's a valiant man. Little faith. He says. As for a great heart, little faith had none. And so not everybody is a valiant Christian. Not everybody is a great heart Christian, but everybody should put on the armor and wear the shield. And I think that's the takeaway. Is you should wear the armor and take the shield with you. But he goes on to say, and he brings Peter up into this, and he says, "But I'll tell you what, if you're faint-hearted, that is, if you're weak-hearted, if you're mistrusting, if your confidence is placed wrongly, and if you and all of this will bring about a guilt, and so you'll end up in the slough of despond. If those things creep in, he says, take a look at Peter. Peter had on the armor and had the shield, and when these things crept into the cracks. This is what it reduces you to someone of little faith. And so I think, the idea of one being little faith throughout the whole pilgrimage is what he's talking about. But also, you can have that little faith at points in your Christian life, like Peter did. So I think the takeaway, the caution, the warning is what you said. I think the takeaway is wear the armor, strengthen faith, draw down on the jewels that are union with Christ to do that, and seek to be the valiant man, the valiant Christian, the great-hearted Christian who sets his eyes on Christ. I think that's the takeaway.
And yet, in the context of this introduction to him, he certainly is in better spiritual shape than turn away or ignorance. Now
Yeah.
we don't know the end of ignorance yet. We will learn that, but he shares things in common with them, but he is fundamentally in a different place than they are.
Yeah. 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 I think we've said this weeks and weeks and weeks ago, and that is the the lowest point of the Christian's life is still higher than the unbeliever's the highest part of the unbeliever's life. So you take heart in that, um, and look to Christ to take you up from that low point. because you can only go up, right?
I was going to say on that point with Jonathan as well, that those commonalities between turn aside and ignorance and little faith on the other hand, also though, because of those commonalities, it's going to cast doubt or lack of assurance onto little faith. In other words, little faith isn't necessarily always going to know that he isn't just another ignorance or turn aside. In fact, there might be moments where he's thinking to himself, I think my name is really just turn aside. When in fact he really is little faith, but because of that commonality, he loses the joy and the benefit of his assurance, particularly in the face of adversity when he withers.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And that, there are a couple of things that I know we're probably drawn low on our time here, but there are a couple of things here that I think are important. The first one is, you're going to not be a very useful person ecclesiastically. I mean, people are not going to tap you for things if this is the way you live your Christian life. But he says at the end of this piece something he goes back to all the time. He says, we desire the king a convoy as we go throughout the pilgrimage, sort of with others on the way is the idea. And if you're little faith and you are passing by this dark lane, murder lane, and no one's there to tell you, maybe it's not a good idea for us to sleep there, um, you're doing it alone, you're going this thing alone. It's, I think that it just highlights again, as the progress does, the value of fellowship, companionship along the way. Because if you just kind of show up the way little faith does, you're going to doubt yourself. Other people are going to doubt you. You're going to trundle along.
Well, Jeff, we are out of time, as you sensed, and yet, thank you again. This is always insightful and stimulating, and just very useful. So, thank you for guiding us through this little section of Pilgrim's Progress yet again.
Yeah, great to be with you guys. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Theology on the Go. If you are interested in entering to win a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, this Banner of Truth copy that all of us are using, you can go to placefortruth.org, click on the Theology on the Go link, or to theologyonthego.org. And if you'd like to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, there you can go to alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. If you can rate and review this podcast, we would appreciate that. That helps us spread the word. And if you know someone who'd be helped by it, please feel free to pass it along. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.